Good afternoon. This webinar series, Best Practices in Research Administration, is being presented by Incura with the financial support of Eurasia Foundation and the United States Department of State. The slides and recordings of all Research Administration Best Practices webinars are available on the Eurasia Foundation's website. Make sure to also check out additional resources on that page, including articles, past webinars, and more. Check your chat box for the link. To download this presentation and supplementary materials, please go to the handout section of your control panel. We will have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the webinar. Please send your questions via the chat box in your control panel. My name is Panda Powell, Director of Sponsored Programs and Research Compliance at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. This webinar is the last webinar in a 5-part series on best practices in research administration. Today's topic is institutional policy. Our learning objectives are: participants will have a basic understanding of the elements of a policy. Participants will be able to distinguish between a policy and a procedure. We will acquire an understanding of policy needs as related to the university research enterprise, and we will gain exposure to types of policies required by external funding organizations and agencies. What is a policy? According to the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, a policy is prudence or wisdom in the management of affairs, management or procedure based primarily on material interest, a definite course or method of action selected from among alternatives and in light of given conditions to guide and determine present and future decisions, a high-level overall plan embracing the general goals and acceptable procedures, especially of a governmental body. For research administration, we think policy as our goal statement, where the sponsors and the institution interests meet. Why are policies needed? They're needed to ensure institution meets federal, state, sponsor, and any additional requirements, to achieve consistency in the operations of the institution, to ensure strong internal controls within the institution, to protect the institution, both the institution's reputation, so there are no negative publicity, and financial, so you don't have any cost to your university if an unallowable expense happens to be disallowed by the sponsor. The institution would have to cover that cost as well as potential penalty and interest depending upon the sponsor, some of which was discussed in last week's presentation on award management. For achieving consistency, you want to make sure that all of your students, staff, and faculty know what rules they need to follow to make sure there is no reputational or financial risk to the institution. Types of policies. There are many different types of policies. Different external funding agencies require different policies. You also may be in part of a university system, which is what the University of North Carolina is inside of. We have 16 schools governed by the state of North Carolina. So in addition to other policies, we have to follow our system policies. There also can be policies from the United States government which has overarching requirements. The main one is the Uniform Guidance, which is codified in 2 CFR Part 200. And then there are federal laws. For example, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Export Administration Act, or what we call export controls, and the Rybakoff Amendment or the Tax Reform Act. The link to these 3 acts are on the last few pages. Additional types of policies can be very specific. The protection of human subjects is a regulatory policy. The International Compilation of Human Research Standards, the link to that is right here for your convenience. You should know that if you are collaborating with different universities in different countries and you have human subjects in your research, there will be different time frames for getting approval from each country or institution's institutional review boards. China may take 1 month. Brazil may take 1 year. So you need to think about that when you're developing the policies and when you're developing your proposal. The protection of animal subjects, the animal welfare, does cover all institutions, whether they're United States or international. We have biosafety, research misconduct, conflict of interest, which can be financial and other, a limited submission process, policy if the sponsor limits the number of proposals a single entity can submit. Intellectual property, how would you distribute your ownership of a copyright or a patentable idea between the organization and the creator? There are additional policies like radiation safety, or if you have drones on your campus. Another type could be your PI eligibility. Who on your campus can actually submit on behalf of your university? Policy development. Review all outside institution policies related to the specific policy in development. Review your institutional processes and practices. Review institution and or system policies. Determine your team members. Which departments do you need to have involved in this policy development? Who is the individual or the position in that department that needs to be part of the team? Determine the needs of your institution. And remember, your institutional policy can be different than other institutional policy, but you still need to meet the overarching policy, such as a conflict of interest policy. And you need to set your timeline for the development of the policy. Websites of other universities are great resources for these policy developments. A few links were included in last week's presentation. Additional links are in the end of this presentation. One example is a PI eligibility policy. Who should be involved? Maybe your general counsel office, your provost's office, your research office, and maybe your deans of each school should be involved. A policy can have many different sections. You need a policy header. In that policy header, you need the title, which may come from your external policy. A numbering scheme. Maybe you start with the year it's developed and then something as simple as number 1, number 2, number 3. Authority. Which department has the authority over this policy? And name a position, not a person. History. Is this a new policy or is this a revised policy? So put the date there. And when you do revise the policy, add your revision date there. Source of authority. Who will be the ultimate approver of this policy? That is the person you put in the source. Related links. Do you have any? If you do, add them here. Your link can be a system policy, or it can be another institutional policy, or it could be the federal policy that you are writing your institutional policy for. And the responsible office. Who handles the questions and the revisions to this policy? And remember to put that by position, not by name. In a policy, when you develop it, you want to use position titles, not individual names. Body of policy. There may be more or fewer sections in a policy. It depends upon what your institutional needs are. You will, however, need a purpose, a scope, the actual policy, which may have multiple sections, delegations of responsibilities, who will do what, procedures. It is best to reference the process in the policy in a not defined way. For example, you put a link to the actual process inside your policy. Processes can be revised more frequently than a policy should be revised. And your record-keeping requirements should be part of your policy. I have given you an example here of UNCW's export control compliance policy. So you can see that we have the authority as the provost and the vice chancellor for academic affairs. History, it was established in October 1 of 2007. The source of authority is the Export Administration Regulation, as well as some individual ones. Related link to our patent policy, because we feel the export control and the patent policy tie together. Responsible office, which is our office, the Sponsored Programs and Research Compliance. How a university starts a policy process. Here's an example of our conflict of interest, which is a recent U.S. federal policy that institutions had to then come up with an institutional policy to meet requirements. The National Institutes of Health established a new regulation for any organization receiving funding. The funding number is that NOT-OD-14-081. I've provided the link if you want to go there, as well as the Federal Register link. For U.S. regulation, all these policies have to be posted in the Federal Register. What this policy says is that all organizations submitting proposals or receiving awards from NIH, National Institutes of Health, are required to follow this regulation. The individual organization or university determines how the NIH regulation is implemented. This policy is presented here. This is the actual NIH conflict of interest policy, pages 1. The next slides are pages 2 and 3. You can see that the same parts of a policy are here in the federal policy. You have your release date, you have it, who is issued by, the announcement number, and then we go into the purpose, the background. Why did they have this policy? They're making improvements to the FCOI, which is the Financial Conflict of Interest module for submission of financial conflict of interest reports for NIH grants and cooperative agreements. And then it references the federal regulation at 42 CFR Part 50. That gives us our overarching, this is the law we now have to comply with. Then we have some background, so you know why why National Institutes of Health made this policy. Further on down the policy, we talk about how you're going to implement the conflict of interest policy, where you can find the NIH information on their ERA Commons website, where do you submit reports? If there's a revision, where do you put that? When do you not submit a report? All of that information is here in this part of the policy. The last part of the policy involves contact information. Who do you need to contact if you have a specific question about parts of their policy? And this page gives you all of that information. On this slide, I have given you a copy of the first page of UNCW's conflict of interest policy. You can see that we have the authority, the history, the source of the authority. For UNCW, it is the University of North Carolina Policy Manual, which is the system manual, which is in compliance with the federal policy as well as the state of North Carolina policies. Our related links gives you the Federal Register 42 CFR, annual reports, and the UNC Policy Manual links, as well as the responsible office. Then we start into the body, which has the policy and the scope. A link to the full policy is on the last few slides. As an example, I've also included the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill policy on individual conflicts of interest and commitment. While University of North Carolina Chapel Hill is part of our system, their institutional interpretation of the federal conflict of interest policy is slightly different than UNCW's. So your policy does not have to look like everybody else's. You need to develop the policy to meet the needs of your organization and to adhere by the letter of the overarching policy. A further example of a conflict of interest policy is East Carolina University, another university in the UNC system, which follows the same rules that UNCW and UNC Chapel Hill do, but their policy is a little bit different and their format is different. They still have a policy number, title, authority, history, but they have additional fields like category and subcategory. And they lay out their policy a little bit differently than UNCW and UNC Chapel Hill. This slide, conflict of interest policy, is a continuation of the prior slide from East Carolina University. You can see that East Carolina University included a definition section so that in their policy everyone, to achieve consistency, will know what they mean for certain terms inside East Carolina University's policy. These definitions do also match the definitions in the federal overarching policy. If you are interested in the full policies from UNCW, East Carolina University, and UNC Chapel Hill, here are the 3 links. A procedure. What is a procedure? A fixed step-by-step sequence of activities or course of action with a definite start and end point that must be followed in the same order to correctly perform a task. Repetitive procedures are called routines. A procedure is also a term used to define a series of steps taken together to achieve a desired result. Procedures explain how to accomplish a task. A procedure is sometimes called a work instruction. A less formal definition is a description of how to meet your stated goal. This schematic just breaks down your processes a little bit more. You have your input, which in this case of the conflict of interest policy is the actual policy from the United States federal government. The strategy is partly setting up your team, determining what your needs are. Then you develop your policy. After your policy is developed, then you start working on your procedures or processes. Should you need more information, you can then have work instructions if you need to break it down to the Vice President for Research will be doing X, Y, or Z. Then the Director of Sponsor Programs will do A, B, and C. You can even write your work instructions down to your departmental admin or your secretary. This is what they do. It depends upon the needs of your organization. Elements of a procedure. What department position in the department has overall responsibility for the procedure? You would want to say which department and then who inside that department is responsible. What departments are involved? This may be different than the team who developed the internal policy. You may need individuals from your controller's office or from your financial office. Depending upon the policy, you may need someone from your student affairs department. Who will be doing individual parts of the process? Always use titles of positions, not individuals' names. Name any resources needed. Do you need an electronic system? Do you need a website? For UNCW, for conflict of interest, we have an electronic system, and everyone must use it to report and to annually report. When will the procedure occur? You need a start and an end date, and it may be a rolling start and end date. Every year you do these steps. Will there be any allowances made if the procedure is not followed? So are there exceptions to the procedure? If you are allowing that, you should include in the process who has the authority to approve an exception, and then who receives the exceptions request. The more detailed you can be in your processes, the better. Once again, everyone will know what they need to do. Here I have given you an example of a procedure of UNCW's. This is our time and effort certification procedures. We give you the authority, the area, the history, the responsible office, the same elements that are inside of the policy, so we're all achieving consistency between the policy headers and the procedure headers. We then give a short paragraph about why we need the effort certification. Where is our federal requirements that say we have to do this? And then we start on the process. We will do effort reporting on a semester and summer basis. Here's the when, here's the why. Who has to do time and effort? All exempt SPA, EPA, different classifications of employees within the university. And then the other steps tell you where to find things. Once again, we do effort certification through an electronic system. We reference that here, and there are positions of people for contact if someone has a question. Remember, when you're writing a procedure, to include consequences if the process or the policy is not followed. So it's clear to everyone, this is what you need to do, and here's what happens if you do not do that. Here I have included links to the full procedures for UNCW's time and effort, as well as East Carolina University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So you can see how 3 different universities in a same higher education system interpreted the time and effort procedures. For United States federal funding, the next few slides are examples of agency-specific certifications and assurances that your institution is certifying that you are in compliance with all of these when you submit a federal proposal. Normally, an authorized organizational official completes this certification, or someone with that authority in the sponsored programs office. The agency-specific certifications assurances state, by signing this agreement, the authorized official assures compliance with the following. This set of assurances can be the start of policy development for you, depending upon your institution, your research base, and what funding stream you want to go for. Research misconduct is a requirement of all U.S. federal funding sources, as well as some international funding sources. This link talks about the requirements for the National Institutes of Health. However, a number of U.S. sponsors follow this same guidance, as well as animal welfare. International institutions do have to have a federal-wide assurance number for any animal research they do. This link will start you on the different aspects of your institutional policy and the requirements that will have to be included. The human subjects, once again, there will be U.S. federal requirements, and your home country may have different or additional requirements. This link gives you the NIH list, which, once again, a number of federal agencies follow the same rules. And remember that your institutional review board may have a different time frame for approvals of your research with human subjects. So always allow time for that. There's a lobbying prohibition. This link gives you that information. Additionally, there are terms and conditions in federal awards that have policy implications. You need to review these and determine what needs to be a policy and what does not. Foreign institutions are required to follow a number of these terms and conditions, and they will be included in your award. So it is imperative that you review these prior to submitting your proposal. The non-delinquency on federal debt. If you have a federal debt with the United States government, you cannot get funding from them. Debarred and suspension, the same thing. Do you have a drug-free workplace? Do you have a policy on drug-free workplace? The Public Law 100-690 requires that all organizations receiving grants from any U.S. federal agency agrees to maintain a drug-free workplace. Foreign recipients may be exempted from the drug-free workplace requirement based on a documented finding by the NIH awarding office. Whether you have this policy or not will be determined by your institution, the type of research that you're doing, and the sponsors you're submitting to. Additional terms and conditions can be human stem cell research, research on transplantation of human fetal tissue, research involving recombinant or synthetic nucleic acid molecules. These will all determine what type of research you are doing at your institution and what are your needs. Once again, depending upon the sponsor, you may need policies that cover these two sections: the inclusion of women and minorities as subjects in clinical research and reporting, sex, gender, racial, and ethnic participation, and the inclusion of children as subjects in clinical research. Your institution would have to determine what your needs are. However, there are links on all of these slides to give you more information. This example is the NIH-specific requirements promoting objectivity in research applicable to subrecipients. This gives you the U.S. law that requires institutions conducting PHS-funded research maintain an up-to-date written enforced policy on financial conflicts of interest. This is more information where the federal policy lies, so you can review it and see the overarching policy for the examples I've given you previously. Here is more information about financial conflict of interest and reporting requirements, as well as the link to NIH standard terms and conditions. The NIH grants policy statement is an ultimate source for a lot of policy needs for any institution. Another area to find what policies you may need is the foreign institution terms and conditions from U.S. federal awards. Below is a list of the name as well as a link to the policy for the drug-free workplace, the human embryonic stem cell research, research on transplantation of human fetal tissue, recombinant DNA molecules and human gene transfer research, women and minority inclusion policy, and inclusion of children policy. Here are additional foreign institution terms and conditions that may require a policy or may just require a process for your institution. When a U.S. institution is collaborating with a foreign institution, there will be a sub-recipient award document that will include these terms and conditions. The slide I provided here is the information for foreign institutions on export controls, which was the example I used prior, on a prior slide. This statement is so that the foreign institution understands that university is subject to United States laws and regulations controlling the export of technical data, computer software, laboratory prototypes, and other commodities, and that its obligations hereunder are contingent upon compliance with applicable U.S. export laws and regulations. This is more information for you because you will need an export controls policy should you collaborate with a U.S. institution or apply for U.S. funding. The next few slides are additional resources with links for policy development. Of particular use, and I have a copy in my office, is the NCURA Regulation and Compliance, the second link here. That manual has a list of all the federal regulations that the United States government has for institutions when they're applying for funding, so you know which policies you need, and it's very, very handy to have on your desk. This one has additional resources as well as University of North Carolina Wilmington policy page, East Carolina University policy page, and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill policy page. Here I have included some links to the Russian Foundation for Basic Research, and you may need to review the actual request for proposals to find out if there's any policies you would need specific to the Russian Foundation for Basic Research or any funding agency. Horizon 2020 is funding from the European Union for Research, and the next three are the links I referenced in one of the prior slides. Do we have any questions? Okay, I do have one question. Isn't it necessary to indicate the time frame of all procedures, not only to mention that when the procedure occurs? Yes, that is an excellent question. You should have a time frame for all of your procedures. So if you know you need to review every year, put that in there. If you know that it needs to start at the beginning of your academic year, put that in there. If you need a specific department to complete a task by a specific time, you can put that in there. I would do more of a month as opposed to a month and a year. So you know then in August of every year, this department, let's say the controller's office, needs to accomplish some type of report or whatever is needed for your process. Okay. Which is more overarching, the strategy of the institution or the policy? As we say in research administration, it depends. Normally, your federal sponsors' policies will be the overarching policy you have to follow. However, if the head of your institution wants to do something different, you have to determine, can you do that and still receive funding from that sponsor? For University of North Carolina, Wilmington, we will look at the federal policies, and then we make sure that our policies adhere to that, and it becomes part of our strategy. Please remember, if you have questions, to enter them in the chat box. Next question. How is the university policy regulated when a grant is issued by the Department Ministry of Defense? For the United States, when we receive funding from the Department of Defense, which I know is a little bit differently than the Ministry of Defense, we usually have a contract mechanism for our award, which is more restrictive than a grant or a cooperative agreement. Therefore, we have a negotiation on what we will accept as terms and conditions. In that, we do have policies from the institution we have to adhere to. If your Ministry of Defense has policies that you have to follow, then you need to ensure that your university policies follow that overarching Ministry of Defense policy. I can say with the United States, when we are doing work with the Department of Defense, there are some terms and conditions in the contracts that are not negotiable. And we as an institution have to decide, is that something we can do, which sometimes requires meetings with the Sponsored Programs Office and the Business Office and General Counsel's Office. Next question. How is the university, oh, I'm sorry, I've read that one. How does one start writing institutional policy when it is newly established and no strategy is available? I would look to other institutionals' policies page to see what they have, and I would also then look at their sponsored projects webpage to see the type of research that that institution is conducting, to see if it matches what your institution will be doing. If you are a smaller university, let's say in Russia, you would probably want to look at a small university in another country. It wouldn't really be in your best interest to look at a very, very large institution that has dissimilar research. But it is always best to look to see what someone else has and then look at it, decide who needs to be discussing your policy and what your needs are for your strategy. Next question. In a research office, who should review the policy or conflict of interest? In most U.S. institutions, the conflict of interest policy starts in the sponsored programs office or in the regulatory compliance office. In larger institutions, those are two separate offices that work very closely together. In smaller institutions, it may all be one office, which is what we have here at UNC Wilmington. The regulatory compliance is within the sponsored programs office. So we work very closely to develop our conflict of interest policy and review it on an annual basis. It is best to have one person in charge to make sure that your review and your development is accomplished in a timely manner. Another question. Does each university policy change, or is it adjusted to each specific sponsor or client? A policy should not change per sponsor or client. The policy should be your overarching, this is how we are going to do business, and normally your sponsor has terms and conditions saying you will follow your policies. It is very, very rare that a sponsor requires a policy change for your university. Next question. Can you tell us how often we should update, revise a policy? A policy should be reviewed annually. However, if the source of your policy, let's say the federal financial conflict of interest policy, is changed, then you would need to change your policy to meet this new revised policy at the federal level. But a minimum is annually you should review. Another question, where can I find out the policy requirement for each funding agency? Funding agencies normally have that information on their websites or in their policy guidance or within the request for proposals for a specific sponsor. A good place for U.S. federal requirements is that Incur Regulation and Compliance Manual. That gives you all of the information you need in one place, and it is updated as needed. Next question. What's the difference between policy and procedure? Your policy is your overarching guiding document of what you need to meet your requirements from the federal agencies or other sponsors. Your procedure is how you will implement the policy. So your procedures will be very detailed in a series of steps of who will do what by when. And we'll list responsibilities of each group that needs to achieve some task to make your policies, make your university be in compliance with your policy. Next question. Can you give an example of conflict of interest in a research program? An example could be you have a federal award, let's say a U.S. federal award, that comes to your university, and part of that award will be subcontracted to another company. Well, that company owner is your faculty member. So you could have a conflict in that your faculty member owns a company, and why are we doing business with that company? Can someone else do it? Or did the university decide to do that work with this company only because the faculty member owns it? In our instance, when things like that happen, we sit down at the proposal stage and have serious conversations as to what truly is needed to get the work done for the project. In that example, also the state of North Carolina has strict rules over who the universities can do business with, and they have a regulation against doing business with an institution with a company owned by a faculty member who is an employee of the state. So it can get very complicated very quickly. When we determine that we have to use that particular company, we set up a management plan that is very, very detailed and is reviewed by our general counsel's office. Another question, Does my staff need a law degree to write the institutional policy? It depends upon your university's requirements. Normally, you do not need a law degree to write a policy. If your institution decides differently, then you would need to have that discussion. With research administration, the research administrator knows more about what should be in that policy than a lawyer would. This concludes my presentation today. As a reminder, the slides and recordings of all research administration best practices webinars are available on the Eurasia Foundation's website. A recording of this webinar, along with the PowerPoint presentation in both English and Russian, will be uploaded by next week. Please check your chat box for the link. To find out more about NCURA, please go to www.ncura.edu. And if you have any other questions about institutional policy, please feel free to contact me at powellp@uncw.edu. If you have other questions about research administration, please contact Mr. Jesse Zito, Director of NCURA Global at sveto@ncura.edu. We hope that you have learned about the basics of research administration throughout this series. Before you exit the webinar, please fill in the post-webinar survey. You can find the link to the survey in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining this webinar series throughout these 5 weeks. We'll be sending out certificates of continued education units issued by NCURA to each participant via email next week. As we are planning to expand our webinar topics in research administration, we're interested in what you would like to learn next. You can answer this question in the post-webinar survey, or you can share your valuable insight by emailing us at c@eurasia.org. If you would like to become an NCURA member or learn about other NCURA educational programs, you can visit www.ncura.edu or contact Claire Chen at chen@ncura.edu. Thank you.